So, Renato, how screwed is P Diddy?
Uh, it's complicated. I'm Renato Mariotti. I'm a former federal prosecutor, a practicing lawyer, and a legal analyst.
And I'm Asha Rangappa. I teach national security law at Yale University. I'm a former FBI special agent, and I'm a legal contributor for ABC News.
And we're here to help you understand topics that can't be boiled down into a soundbite or a tweet.
Well, hoo boy, we had big legal news last week. Not Trump.
Yeah, I mean, candidly, a bigger superstar in many ways, right? P. Diddy was huge. I mean, a lot of people could have criticized his rap game, but obviously here, this is much bigger than that. I mean, this is, I'd say, activity that is really heinous and depraved, and an interesting, a bit unusual indictment coming out of the Southern District of New York.
Yeah, let's talk about the legal theory because I'm interested in it because they've charged. So he's accused of basically being involved in sexual assault, kidnapping, uh, bribery, obstruction of justice, like all these kinds of things. But they are also charging this as a RICO violation. And I
That
know that this is sort of a new trend. It seems like.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the indictment, Asha, that really came to mind is the R. Kelly indictment, also out of New York, the Eastern District of New York, but of hip hop artist who was engaging in sexual exploitation, different but similar, but in a similar vein to P Diddy, and both of those cases were trying to criminalize behavior that occurred mostly outside of New York, particularly out of New York City, outside of New York City. If you look at the P. Diddy indictment, you'll see a lot of California statutes that are cited. And the RICO was originally conceived as a way of charging like La Cosa Nostra, like the Italian mafia, and other organized criminal organizations, street gangs, and so forth, where you have a criminal organization that you could essentially hold the kingpins responsible for the activities of all these minions who are committing mostly state crimes, because murder and rape and assault and all attempted murder are all state crimes, and that was a way of rolling all that up. And so what they've done here is use this as a way of charging in New York violations of California state law, which we see throughout the Diddy indictment.
Yeah. So to go to what you're talking about with the original reasons for RICO, right? So my understanding is that RICO was a way to get to the people at the top because the way ordinary conspiracy law couldn't reach them. So you have an organized crime group, whatever the one you just said, um, and they are engaging in these things that I just mentioned: bribery, extortion, hits on people, a murder for hire. But the actual people executing those things are really kind of the lower rungs of the ladder. And to the extent that you're finding an agreement, say with the hitman, it's there. The person at the top is speaking in code. You kind of know that they want it, or it trickles down in some vague or informal way. So they can't tie the person to the top. And so it makes sense to me in that context, right? Because they're profiting from this criminal activity. Then they're using these enterprises, maybe laundering money through these businesses, and that's giving more money off the top of that. So it's a whole scheme, right? That's also intertwined with business. And I can also see how this could be applied in, say, a gang setting, because those are criminal organizations. They're financing themselves through drugs or selling guns and drugs on the black market. What I think is interesting is the way that RICO has extended to these other contexts too. So I'm thinking of, for example, the admission scandal. I don't know if you remember that. That
Mhm.
was where There was a guy who had a foundation, and basically he was using a quote unquote charitable foundation where people were funneling money as bribes to get their kids into college. And there were a bunch of people. That one was really interesting because they had the guy at the top and they were using RICO really to get to the people at the bottom, like the celebrities and stuff that were paying. Okay, but at least there's money flowing there. Then you see it in Georgia, which is obviously a state level. Again, that's kind of a weird context to use RICO, but there I could at least see like a common purpose. They were all trying to do something illegal, which is overthrow this election with all these sub-conspiracies. What I'm kind of curious about here and with the R. Kelly is it's not really clear to me what the enterprise is or what the common purpose is. Do you know what I'm saying? This isn't like a profit-making kind of entity. It's not necessarily something that's a criminal organization that's operating for criminal ends. It's just sort of it's just sort of like, well, he has a business and he hangs around with an entourage of people, and then they were doing these illegal things.
Yeah, and you use a key term there, Asha, enterprise. That's the term that you actually have to prove up in the RICO context. And like you said, in the context of a street gang even, or the Italian mafia or something, it's understandable what the enterprise is. It's this criminal organization where the people at the very top don't know about every hit that's placed, but it's essentially functions as it's almost like a hierarchical organization. And so, that makes sense in that context. Very odd in this context, and I think that in the R. Kelly case, I mean, they did not mount a very good defense. I wasn't impressed with R. Kelly's defense team, but they could have mounted a defense in which they essentially were saying, "Look, R. Kelly may have done some really horrible things, but he's not a racketeer. He's not racketeering. He's not some gangster. That's not what he's doing." The problem for R. Kelly is similar to the problem here. Essentially, this is being used in New York by New York federal prosecutors in both of those two cases to criminalize conduct outside of New York, but also to sweep in lots of individuals. You used the term a moment ago, Asha, with entourage. Well, that's exactly how I would characterize these people. There's some entourage of people around R. Kelly. There's an entourage of people around Diddy. They're famous. They're rich. Of course, people want to hang around with people like that. Totally understandably, they're off partying or whatever. And essentially, what the feds are doing is saying, "Hey, we don't even have to define exactly who's in the enterprise, and it's not really well defined. It's not like the mob where you become a made man or something through some sort of procedure, right? It's whoever happens to be hanging around with Diddy at a particular moment."
Yeah, I mean, the Justice Manual or the statute actually says an enterprise is defined as including any individual, partnership, corporation, association, or other legal entity, and any union or group of individuals associated in fact, although not a legal entity. So that's pretty much like a bunch of people hanging out together, like which I mean, you could construe it that way, right? And here in the indictment, what's really interesting is they're using the enterprise as his businesses, but also the entourage. And then they say that the purpose, and they call all of this the Combs Enterprise. And they say that the purpose of the enterprise was to preserve, protect, promote, and enhance the power, reputation, and brand of Sean Combs. And to me, this is sort of it seems like the heart of their RICO charge, because this is exactly what they did in the R. Kelly case, which is he's using like the criminal activities, which were the bribery, the paying off, enriching people, concealing them, all of that stuff was all surrounded by was all kind of in service of protecting and promoting the celebrity's image. It's just a really interesting theory to apply the racketeering statute in. And if this works, because it sounds like this is kind of a new model, it basically puts like all celebrities on notice. Because really, I mean, who isn't like if they're doing any kind of criminal activity where their entourage might be involved, I mean, I guess it could be a RICO.
Yeah, well,
with
great.
violation.
Yeah, great point. I mean, I would just say, it's done. RICO is rarely charged by prosecutors. I'll just say that because it's very cumbersome and difficult to prove and a pain in the butt to actually explain to juries at trial. Usually, you use conspiracy or a fraud scheme or something like that to connect up a lot of different activities and people together and lump them in on one count. And but the issue, the reason you use RICO is either you're, let's say, a prosecutor in New York who wants to charge stuff happening all over the country. I'm sure there's some prosecutors in California who may have wanted to charge this case and may have been better positioned to do so. But separately, where there's not an explicit agreement or you really can't prove up an agreement, it's a way of sweeping in people into something and sweeping in all sorts of activity. And I will tell you, it does not always work for the feds, Ash. I mean, there was one case that I can think of particularly where Main Justice charged a bunch of traders at a trading desk at a big bank, all with a RICO enterprise, and it did not fit at all. I mean, they got it not guilty on that count because I'm sure the jury's like, these people are a bunch of bankers at some big bank. They're not like racketeering or whatever. Charge them with fraud or whatever they actually did. And I think here, I mean, that is a way you could attack this. But I think in the R. Kelly case, and again in this case, part of what's actually going on here is that the prosecutors know that the jury's going to hate this guy. They're going to hate what he's doing, whether he's guilty or not technically of some particular counts. And so really, I think part of what happened here. I mean, to me, the other takeaway I would take from just a first glance at this indictment, Asha, is very low specifics. And it really seems to me like part of what the prosecutors are trying to do here is sweep up as many potential people into this as possible and just kind of allege broadly things without having a lot of specifics about specific victims, specific times, specific places, so that this way they're just kind of putting a marker out there. And essentially, they're going to potentially freak out a lot of Diddy's friends into flipping against him.
Yes, it is low on specifics, but one thing that I did notice is that it goes back really far. So it goes back to 2008. So it seems like one advantage of the RICO conspiracy charge is that you can bring in criminal acts that may be unable to be prosecuted on their own because, for example, like not only is it like a state crime, but it's also the statute of limitations has passed. But they do mention that it goes back to 2008, right? So it sounds like they are willing and able to produce some victims that are going to be able to corroborate this from that point forward. Because for a RICO charge, you also have to show that the criminal activity is continuous, right? Or continuing, like it's a pattern, it's a repetitive thing that's gone on over time and that is likely to continue.
That's right. Now you can do a similar kind of move in terms of statute of limitation with conspiracy. So if you have, let's say, me and you agree to whatever, engage in our bank robbery and conspiracy, technically speaking, we can, or drug dealing conspiracy or whatever. Technically speaking, if we've been doing it for 20 years, they can sweep up everything we're doing as long as we're continuing to engage in the conspiracy or trying to hide or do something else in our efforts regarding these crimes in the, let's say the last 5 years, hypothetically. But what the advantage of RICO is for them here is they don't have to prove a specific agreement about specific crimes with specific people. It's all just
Right.
sort of swept in. I will say, Asha, just to kind of put myself on a limb here and make a prediction, I think that this is a placeholder indictment. I think what happened was they saw, Diddy's attorney, who well-known New York criminal defense attorney, was out there on television saying there's only one victim, that's all they've got, and he was out there interviewing everyone and locking in witnesses into a story. And I think they wanted to put the kibosh on that and get out ahead of him and say, hey, make this guy a pariah. Like, essentially let the world know we got him, we're going to indict him, and that sort of thing. And also get him in custody. And now the pressure's on Diddy. Now Diddy may want to cut a deal or whatever, but I think that they're going to supersede later, kind of like what they did with Sam Bankman-Fried, same office, put out this kind of placeholder indictment, got the guy out of the Bahamas, and then they superseded later and added a lot more stuff.
Yeah, I think the victims here, though, will be really important, because there is a big distinction here compared to R. Kelly. Because in R. Kelly, the victims were underage. So they were per se illegal. There's no question that he was engaging in illegal sexual acts. Whereas here, it seems like, and from what I read, I think this might be the direction that they're going, is to argue that this was all consensual, right? That because what the crux of the allegation here is that basically um, Diddy was having these big sex parties, which he called freakouts. And he would bring in commercial sex workers. He would have women that he had lured in with, promises of a relationship or a career, and then he would use his like influence and leverage and coerce them into performing sex acts and taking drugs, and then basically like abuse them and beat them, and then later on like hide them and pay off people who are helping, all of this stuff. I mean, it's really bad. And the details are all in the indictment. uh but it seems like the defense could be these were just sex parties, and everyone there was just there to have fun. And to go back to the RICO thing, what does this have to do with the price of milk? Like, what does this have to do? Like, in other words, you're basically taking, not only are you criminalizing stuff that we believe is consensual. So I'm acting as a defense lawyer here, but you're kind of now tying this to some enterprise or a big like scheme, and these were just parties that we were having every now and then, and it was all consensual.
Right. I mean, I agree. I agree with what you're saying in terms of what the defense argument's going to be. I mean, I'll say this as somebody who's a criminal defense attorney in the midst of a defense criminal trial against the Justice Department right now. Yes, that is exactly what the theory is going to be. It's going to be even more pointed than that. I mean, these people were professional sex workers, at least that's, I believe that was alleged in the indictment. So essentially, the argument's going to be from the defense. These people are pros. Of course, they want to work with Diddy because working with Diddy and being involved in these sex parties, they might meet all sorts of rich and famous people who wouldn't want to be at a Diddy sex party. Like this is just, of course he's an extravagant guy. Of course he's doing over the top things. He's P Diddy and he's famous and he's a crazy rapper or whatever. That's not a crime, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, it's sordid. Yes, it's this. Yes, it's that, and so on. But it's not a crime, and it's certainly not some sort of racketeering scheme. And that's why I actually think if you could have charged us maybe in California with more straightforward crimes, it would be stronger. But I will say this:
Why
if
not
somebody
charge it in California?
because the prosecutors in the Southern District want to rush ahead of the people in California, just like the
Okay, so
prosecutors.
this is just a turf war.
This is a turf war.
Okay.
Oh yeah, just like the EDNY prosecutors rushed ahead of the prosecutors in Chicago, who brought their own indictment, much stronger indictment, candidly, weeks later. But it was just they wanted to be the ones to do it. But separately, I will just say though, Asha, real life trials are not decided by like Chat GPT, AI robots. They're decided by juries. And I'll tell you, and this is frustrating for me all the time because I have clients like my current client who are essentially, I have no doubt that an AI robot would acquit the client, but will 12 random people. And here, regardless of what you think about how this meets the elements of RICO and whether they could actually prove a RICO conspiracy, the most jurors who are watching this and seeing this unfold are going to hate this guy. They're going to hate what he's doing. They're going to hate this behavior, and consensual or not, or professional sex workers or not, or they, did he know exactly what was going on or not, or was it really an enterprise or not? Jurors are just going to hate what's going on here and vote against it effectively by voting him guilty. And that's the problem that Diddy and his lawyers, his legal team have.
Yeah. Well, and the other problem they have is, Lordy, there are tapes. I mean, he apparently videotaped some or a lot of this activity. presumably because he thought that it would somehow give him leverage to keep people quiet or something like that, but it's now evidence. So that's
Or
not
yeah,
great.
maybe you wanted to watch him. I mean, it sounds like, I mean,
Right.
they allege his own gratification was part of this. I mean, this may be how he gets off, but it's a huge problem for him, huge problem for his team. And look, there's no question that all of this is depraved, and it's just everyone is going to condemn this, and he's just in a very difficult position sitting in federal prison. So, ironically, the reason I said it's complicated at the beginning is legally he's not in as bad of a spot than he is in reality. And the reality is he's in custody, he's already serving a sentence effectively, and the evidence is only going to get worse, and everyone's going to run for the hills and cooperate with the feds, and the jury's going to dislike him no matter what.
Yeah, because R. Kelly, to go back to that as sort of the precedent for this kind of theory, he's serving 30 years and then 20 years on the two different charges. I forget which is which.
Yeah, he's totally screwed. Now, one of his business managers got off, but and that's the thing. The hangers-on types they have their defense. Like, hey, I had no idea. He's just some rich bajillionaire, music star. But the guy himself doing depraved things, like, good luck with that.
Yeah, and he's now in Metropolitan Detention Facility, the same place that Jeffrey Epstein was placed. And footnote, it does seem like now, in retrospect, that case could have been charged as a RICO, because I mean, it seems like that was more fitting of a actual enterprise of what he was running, because he literally had Ghislaine Maxwell out recruiting these victims and was kind of using it to, I don't know, bring these high rollers into his orbit and stuff.
I agree. I mean, first of all, yeah, that prison you're talking about is in New York City, and it is where people who are involved in court proceedings in New York are often kept. There's a counterpart in Chicago that I'm very familiar with, the MCC here, Metropolitan Correctional Center. But when you're talking about the Epstein case, I agree with you that it could have been brought as a RICO case. Certainly, Ghislaine Maxwell served a role for him that's much more like a lieutenant or like a second in command. But they didn't have to do that there because they could just charge conspiracy and much more straightforward
Yeah.
crimes that are easier to prove up. I mean, I think RICO, like when you have a
Yeah,
RICO
what's
case,
the point? Is it just sexier? Well, you said it gives the venue, so it gives the U.S. Attorney's Office a way to snag it for their own.
right,
It potentially carries heftier penalties. It can turn state violations into a federal violation.
right.
It can bring in old conduct, but the other side is that it's a very unwieldy statute that kind of doesn't necessarily fit very easily into these types of or into all these new contexts.
Right. Like if you're a conservative, I don't mean politically conservative, but if you're a careful, considerate prosecutor, you rarely charge RICO. The usual context is street gangs that are committing murders, because murders are state crimes and they're very rigid organizations. And everyone, it's a way of holding the ringleaders of the gang responsible for all of these murders that have been committed often by underage individuals. But something like this, usually, I mean, you can find ways to prosecute this federally for something else that fits better and is much easier and more straightforward to prove, as we might see in a different indictment in a moment. But here, I do think that part of the motivation, I mean, the big part of the motivation is because the New York prosecutors wanted to do it. But even apart from that, there are some state crimes that are mentioned here, and that's got to be part of the motivation as well.
It'll be interesting to see what happens.
Indeed.
Okay, Renato, since we don't have a lot of big Trump case news lately, so we've been kind of diving into some of these other cases that have been coming up. And one big one that dropped a little over a week ago, and I've only just now had a chance to dive into it, is this indictment against two individuals involved in what was called the Terrorgram Collective. And it's kind of it's a very disturbing and I think promising indictment, in my opinion, given the threat of domestic violent extremism that's on the rise here in the United States.
Yeah, I gotta say, Asha, this didn't get a ton of press, not as much as I think it deserved.
I agree.
Um, it, yeah, if I wasn't really keyed in on legal news, I don't think that I would have read this indictment. But it is striking. A terrorgram is a combination of two words, terrorism and Telegram, which is an app many of you may have used. I've used it before, where you communicate privately with people in a kind of form of text messaging that is ephemeral, that does not last or stay for a long time, but it is used sometimes by people involved in criminal activity. Telegram and Signal are both used for that purpose at times. But essentially, this is a group, it's a white supremacist group that was pushing and encouraging violence against people who supported racial integration, racial equality. And so they actually were targeting, for example, a United States senator, a United States federal judge, a United States attorney, all because they were either people who are minorities, people of color, or they were people who had values that were supportive of a racial equality.
Yeah. So let's bookmark two things that you just said. So first, there that you highlighted. First is Telegram, and I think it's worth pointing out how Telegram is a little bit different than other social media platforms. And I just wrote a piece for Cafe a couple of weeks ago on the arrest of one of Telegram's founders, um, Pavel Durov. And he was arrested in France because of the fact that this platform is basically used for criminal activity. And so there's a couple of features, and you've used it. I have not used it, but it is different than other social media platforms in a few ways. So the first is that it combines a lot of different features, right? So you talked about the encrypted one-to-one messaging, which is sort of like Signal, but it also has big group chats, which is sort of like WhatsApp, except there's no limit to the number of people that can be in a group. So in WhatsApp, for example, I think there's a limit of like 1,249 or something like that, but there's no limit, and you can forward messages from one group to another. So you can actually, amplify something very, very quickly to huge swaths of people. This is, cause problems in many countries because like a rumor can spread and you can have mob violence before like police can respond to it. And then there's also channels, which are sort of broadcasting channels where the owner of a channel can produce content and videos that other people can watch, and there's also no limit to the number of people that can be subscribed to a channel. So it almost seems like it's Signal, WhatsApp, TikTok, and Facebook all combined, and with almost zero content moderation.
Yeah, well, the content moderation is, I think, a big decider. I view it, I mean, I've used Telegram. I view it as similar to Signal. I think Signal has a lot of the same features. It has not gotten closed out by the French authorities in the same way. But I think one of the problematic elements of both of those platforms is I mentioned ephemeral. They do not only are they encrypted, as you mentioned, but it's easy to set disappearing messages. And that's a very attractive feature. And I know, and I will just say, as somebody who does a lot of work helping companies deal with regulatory issues that are non-criminal, the US regulators are really tamping down on this as well, Signal and Telegram, because, if you're like the SEC, for example, you don't want companies that you regulate to have their employees using disappearing messages. Like that's very concerning and problematic. But of course, can be used to facilitate violent extremism, and it was, by the way, I think it was at Signal or Telegram. One of them was used by January 6th attackers as well, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, they were using Signal, I think.
Similar.
Yeah. So this platform was being used, and I think what's another thing that's happening here because of the huge number of people that this can reach, because they were not just doing the one-on-one communication, they were putting videos on these channels of how to build bombs, of how to sabotage critical infrastructure. Like, it was like how-to manuals. And they were encouraging, this was a global radicalization effort. This was drawing on white nationalist ideology. And it wasn't just targeting people who were, you know, in favor of racial equality. I think you have to kind of know a little bit of the history of white nationalist ideology to understand what they're doing here. They're trying to promote accelerationism, which is uh, uh, the idea that it has its origins in a book that was published in the 1950s, I think, called The Turner Diaries. This is a fiction book that's sort of the Bible for white nationalists. And basically, it depicts a person who is fighting for white nationalists who are now involved in a race war with the federal government. And their goal is to overthrow the federal government. They're going to deport all the immigrants. They're going to hang all the leftists and the communists and black people, and they're going to establish this white utopia. So the goal is to instigate this race war. This has become the blueprint of white nationalists. That this is how, like, the political system is corrupt. It's catering too much to, you know, immigrants, blacks, Jews, liberals, whatever. The only path is violence, and the only way to get there is to force the federal government into this war. So this is what they're doing. So this is the sabotage of the critical infrastructure. This is all about trying to instigate this face-off with the federal government, and that's what they're trying to do. And they're also appealing to people all around the world. Like, they celebrate global attacks motivated by white supremacy, like the Christchurch shooting in New Zealand. And they actually inspired some people in other countries. One in Turkey, I think, and one in I think Slovenia is where it was, to engage in these kinds of acts everywhere. And in that regard, it was like almost exactly like ISIS. Like, it's putting this ideology out there, giving the how-to manuals, encouraging, enticing, inspiring people, soliciting people to engage in these acts of violence, down to the fact that they were saying, if you conduct an attack and it's successful, you will become a saint. In the same way that the, Islamic fundamentalists hype up martyrdom, it's basically the same thing. And it's saying you'll be revered forever and you'll be in our whatever Saint Hall of Fame on the Terrorgram collective. But it's acting as like basically a proselytizing mission, very similar to the way that, we have seen international terrorist organizations. And that's what I think is really striking, Renato, about this, is that this is the Justice Department finally addressing this as a transnational ideology that is that has like mass impact, as opposed to the way that it's typically treated white nationalist crime in the United States, domestic terrorism, which is as these lone wolf things. Does that make sense what I'm saying? I mean, we are always like, oh, it was Timothy McVeigh, and Timothy McVeigh is completely unrelated to any other, white nationalist motivated activity before. And January 6th was completely unrelated to Timothy McVeigh. And if you read the people who have written about this, a great book is Kathleen Belew, Bring the War Home. Highly recommend that. And Jeffrey Toobin's Homegrown, which is about Timothy McVeigh. These are not lone wolves. These are people who are all connected by an ideology and loosely associated in the same way that, the San Bernardino shooter is connected to ISIS. We haven't ever treated it that way. We treat them as one-offs. And this is the federal government finally saying, This is a transnational movement. And I think that's a huge step towards combating domestic violent extremism.
Yeah, wow. It makes a lot of sense. I will say just reading the indictment was very educational to me. I had not read the books, either of the books you mentioned. I am aware that there's white nationalist movements. I'm aware that there are groups, but it was a lot packed into this, and I think it's an interesting contrast to the indictment that we looked at just a moment ago, right? In other words, the Diddy indictment, sweeping terms, very vague. The 14 pages of it includes just like a lot of boilerplate about forfeiture and other things. This is a much longer indictment, much more detailed, literally has excerpts from manuals. And by the way, no RICO charge. There's a conspiracy charge, which is much easier and more straightforward to prove, that covers a lot of activity, but then lots of specific counts of lots of specific things that they did, some of which are easier to prove. So as backstops, like, hey, you doxed this person, a federal official. You tried to solicit violence against this federal official. Things that even if they lose on a hate crime a charge or something like that, they have as a backstop. So to me, this was an indictment that, despite the fact that the Diddy indictment got all of this press and all of this attention, I think that more work went into this, and this is for me as a lawyer, a more impressive piece of work that went into this as somebody who had used to investigate crime than the Diddy indictment was.
No, this is very impressive, and I have a feeling that it's gonna sweep up more people. Because obviously if they have all these communications, then they know the people, then they have the network now of the people that are, uh, following these channels, communicating with them, planning things, because they were actually actively in contact with people who were planning attacks. And it was Slovakia, not Slovenia. I'm sorry what I said earlier. Um, the other thing that struck me about this indictment is the count for material support to terrorism.
Hmm.
That's typically something that you see in an international terrorism context, right? With declared foreign terrorist organizations. And it looks like the British government had declared the Terrorgram collective as a transnational terrorist organization, which I think gave the Justice Department the green light to use this tool that they would otherwise use for ISIS, Tamil Tigers, Hamas. They can use it in this context. Again, um, a real step forward, because typically these white nationalist groups, because these people were located in California, they're here. I mean, they're communicating worldwide. But as you know, Renato, it gets very, very tricky investigating domestic violence extremism, because it is adjacent to, free speech and political speech. Now it's actually kind of merged with at least part of a major political party. So it becomes very dicey, to really investigate this. What will be interesting to see, and I don't think the Justice Department will go this far with other international terrorist organizations, at least ones that we have designated as officially as foreign terrorist organizations, FTOs. The Justice Department is allowed to use certain tools like FISA to intervene in to begin investigations, and insert themselves much earlier in the kind of plotting process, right? The idea is that you want to get in left of boom, right? You want to get in as far left of boom as possible. You know the term left of boom?
No, I don't. So let's explain it
Yeah,
to
left.
our listeners.
Okay, so there's the boom, which is the explosion. Okay, the bomb, the terrorist attack. And if you're imagining a timeline which goes from left to right, you know, the before time, the boom happens, then the after time. The idea is that law enforcement wants to intervene as far left of boom as possible. What tools like FISA do, so FISA is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, it allows for things like electronic surveillance even before there's evidence of actual criminal activity,
Mhm.
because you want to disrupt it really, really early. Okay. And so
Sure.
we don't want to wait for, the 19 hijackers to have their plane tickets and, they need the overt act before they can, at that point, it could be too late. So you want to intervene. We don't allow using those kinds of tools with domestic groups because it interferes with free speech issues, right? So if you have, say, the Proud Boys or the KKK, even if they're hanging around and burning crosses or marching around with their dumb camo uniforms and saying awful things, you can't start surveilling them until they cross some threshold where you believe that they are actually conspiring in criminal activity, which brings you further right. It might still be left of boom, but it's going to be further right. And this is what happened with January 6th. There was chatter, they could see things on social media, but it was like if they intervene too early, it looks like they're trying to censor or you know, whatever. They're trying to shut down political activity. I think it's just going to be a really interesting thing to see, how are they going to use, now that they're kind of acknowledging that this is transnational, that there's critical infrastructure being targeted. Are they going to begin to try to use some of these tools that we use in the international context in this context? Or are they going to continue to try to observe this, waiting until they actually cross, like, unambiguously cross this line before intervening? I think that is really the heart of the question when it comes to whether we can effectively counter domestic violent extremism, which is, by the way, the biggest threat right now that we face in the United States.
Very interesting. I mean, my read on it as somebody looking at this indictment is that they're not there. They're very careful in this indictment. And I talked a moment ago about the backstop. I thought the speech issues, the First Amendment issues, are why they did that. Like,
Mhm.
even if there's some challenge to these hate crime statutes, we still have all these backstops in there. And so I think they're being careful, they're being cautious, but they're clearly not a step ahead. We're seeing more and more white supremacy and white supremacist ideology that is fueling violence not only in the United States but around the globe. And they may need to take more aggressive steps. And sadly, I think what we saw, you used 9/11 as an example. That was an example of people not taking an aggressive posture towards a particular form of terrorism until there was a major tragedy,
Yeah.
and it may unfortunately, the government may not take any steps until another major tragedy occurs in this context.
Well, like I said, I do think they took a big step in kind of acknowledging this as a interconnected network that is transmitting an ideology, encouraging lone wolf attacks that are all in service of, like, a bigger purpose, which they haven't done. One thing that I thought was not there, which could have been, maybe, I mean, when we're talking earlier about RICO could have been used in this context. Um, they didn't charge them with something like seditious conspiracy,
Mhm.
which could have potentially applied under these facts, I think, because they're quite explicit about the idea that their goal is to, accelerate this race war and bring down the existing system and essentially overthrow the United States. And, they did, when they brought the January 6th prosecutions for Proud Boys and Oath Keepers, they did charge seditious conspiracy. In 2010, there was a Christian nationalist group called the Hutari that was charged with seditious conspiracy in Michigan. And that was thrown out because the judge in that case said that there wasn't enough evidence that this was kind of directed at the federal government, that the purpose was there, but I think that was here. This sounded to me, this sounded a lot like the kind of facts that were in a case against Abdul Rahman, the blind sheikh, who was charged with seditious conspiracy. But again, I think that the Justice Department is going to be really, really careful. Even if they can charge seditious conspiracy, they're not going to, unless I think they're, because it's a political crime. And I think the closer that you're getting to speech that, again, and unfortunately at this point intersects with a major political movement in the United States, then it just gets dicey. I think it's unfortunate, but I think they could have charged it here. They didn't.
I actually think, Asha, it's a sign of strength that the Justice Department didn't include a seditious conspiracy charge here. Prosecutors are always thinking about litigation risk. And really, I think they're just lumping this in with all sorts of other litigation risks that they could have. And really, if they had a fallback on seditious conspiracy as the only thing that they could do to put all of this together and have an indictment, like what's called a speaking indictment, where you can kind of lay out the entire pattern of criminal activity, I think they would have done it. But here they had a much more conservative approach that they could take that would get them where they wanted to go. And so sometimes, ironically, these indictments that have big fancy statutes, whether it's RICO, seditious conspiracy, often there's an issue that they're trying to work around, that they're using that as a backstop or to rely on. I think this is, like I said, from a legal perspective, from a prosecutorial perspective, this is not only a very impressive piece of work in terms of investigation, but the indictment looks really rock solid. And I think that was the goal. They wanted to make sure that they took these people down.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that. And I think with the January 6th cases, I don't think they were trying to work around anything. I think they took the step of charging seditious conspiracy because they had to signal that this was really, 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 really serious in that
Yeah.
instance.
I think
It was
also
symbolic. It was symbolic. And it
Yeah,
carries the stigma that they wanted to make sure that those perpetrators would endure as basically as being traitors.
I think that the alternative for them was a conspiracy that didn't sound all that heinous.
Serious. Yeah.
Yeah, it was like a conspiracy to interfere with the lawful functions of the United States or something along those lines, which would just not be viewed as seriously. And so that's why they took that step there. But here, there's a conspiracy that sounds very sinister and heinous, right? And fits the crime very well. And I think that's why they went the other route here.
Well, these two are now under lock and key, so let the games begin. So before we go,
I,
you're in a hotel room.
I am very much in a hotel room. That is because I alluded to this earlier. I have a federal criminal jury trial that I'm in the middle of in LA. And so I am living out of a hotel room right now, and my office nearby, or an office, my firm's office nearby. And it's pretty grueling. It's hard to be away from home.
Yeah. I think you're making the most of your background, though. You don't look like a hostage. Sometimes when people are in like hotel rooms, they're like, they just have like the white background behind them.
Yes.
And yeah. So good for you that you have a little bit of art or something behind you. I was traveling too last week.
Where did you go?
So I went to DC for work. And then I went to Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Nice. Wow.
Yeah.
Tulsa. What were you doing there?
I was giving a talk to the women's law section of the Oklahoma Bar Association.
Okay.
And it went great. I was able to tool around Tulsa a little bit. Saw some sites. They have a lovely little art museum. And I also went down to the Greenwood district, which is, speaking of white supremacy, that was where the Tulsa Race Massacre happened in 1921.
Wow.
And
Black Wall Street, right?
Black Wall Street, 34 square blocks burned to the ground, which, and then, nobody ever heard about it again, I guess, until 2021, when there was like a small article about the 100 year, commemoration. And I think then news organizations started picking it up and people became more conscious of it. But I highly recommend, I picked this book up and I'm reading it now called The Burning. I'm like halfway through
Mm.
because I know nothing about this. But to kind of tie to what we were talking about in the second segment, it's very I mean, it's very disturbing, the whole thing, but the history of the Ku Klux Klan, its formation after the Civil War, how it was actually kind of disbanded because of federal legislation, including the Ku Klux Klan Act that are now being used to prosecute at least one of the charges against Trump, were pretty effective in kind of getting him to disperse. And then it was in 1915, there was a movie called The Birth of a Nation, which
Mhm.
again is propaganda that proselytized people into, this white nationalist movement. Gained a lot of ground. That's when Jim Crow began getting entrenched, and the KKK kind of fashioned itself as a fraternal order, and sort of that's why it wasn't quashed in the same way that it had been post Civil War, and it's continued to grow and morph into the different versions that we see today, including in that Terrorgram, um, you know, indictment.
Wow. I have to say, definitely an episode. This particular episode in American history is one that I don't think you and I learned much about growing up.
I learned
And
zero. I
yeah,
learned
same.
zero.
Yeah, same. So it's a good thing that more attention is being paid to these to white supremacy and white nationalist movements that occurred, unfortunately, throughout much of U.S. history.